The day my world split in two. I always thought trust was the unshakable foundation of a marriage. It's that quiet, invisible thread that holds everything together, even in the face of life's chaos. But the day my wife walked back into my life, 5 years after our divorce, asking for a second chance, was the day I truly understood how fragile trust could be. What she didn't know, what I hadn't yet told her, was that I had uncovered her secret. 10 years of infidelity, hidden beneath the facade of love, loyalty, and partnership. I remember the moment she appeared at my doorstep as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. The soft knock at the door echoed through my quiet house, pulling me from the haze of a Saturday morning. I hesitated, staring at the wooden door as if the answer to its mystery could be found in the stillness of the moment. My heart beat faster than it should have for something so ordinary. When I opened the door, there she was, Samantha, the woman I had once promised to love for better or worse, standing on the threshold of my carefully rebuilt life. She looked different, yet heartbreakingly familiar. Her auburn hair, once perfectly styled, now fell in loose, unkempt waves around her face. Her emerald eyes, always her most captivating feature, seemed duller, clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or guilt. "Alex," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the doorknob. The sight of her brought a rush of emotions I hadn't expected: anger, sadness, confusion, and beneath it all, a quiet, lingering ache that I hated myself for still feeling. "Samantha," I replied, my voice steady but cold. "What are you doing here?" She shifted awkwardly, her hands twisting the strap of the leather bag slung over her shoulder. I need to talk to you. Please, just hear me out." I considered slamming the door, ending the conversation before it could even begin. But curiosity, damn that insidious thing, got the better of me. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. As she walked past me, the faint scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn for years, stirred memories I'd worked hard to bury. We sat across from each other in the living room, the air thick with tension. She seemed smaller than I remembered, her confidence chipped away by whatever had brought her here. I studied her, noting the lines around her eyes and the way her shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. "I've missed you," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I wanted to see you, to apologize, to see if there's any chance we could try again." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Try again?" I echoed, my voice laced with disbelief. "After everything that happened?" "I know I hurt you," she said quickly, tears pooling in her eyes. "I was selfish, and I made mistakes. But I've changed, Alex. I've had 5 years to think about what I lost, and I just want a chance to make things right." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to my own ears. "You think 5 years is enough to erase what you did? To erase 10 years of betrayal?" Her eyes widened, and I saw the color drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I said nothing. I let her sit there, squirming, under the weight of my gaze. Then I stood, walking over to the small desk in the corner of the room. From the drawer, I pulled out a folder, worn and frayed at the edges from the countless times I'd opened it. I dropped it onto the coffee table in front of her. "Go ahead," I said, my tone icy. "Take a look." She hesitated, her trembling, hands hovering over the folder before finally flipping it open. As her eyes scanned the pages, emails, text messages, photos, I watched her face crumble. The confident facade she'd tried to maintain shattered, leaving only raw, unfiltered guilt in its place. "How?" she began, her voice breaking. "How did you find this?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall as I stared down at her. "Does it matter? I know everything, Samantha. Every lie, every excuse, every time you told me you were working late or out with friends, 10 years of lies, and you expect me to just forget it all because you've changed?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't think you'd ever find out. I thought I could fix things before it all fell apart." I laughed again, the sound harsher this time. "Fix things? You destroyed our marriage, Samantha. You took every ounce of trust I had and stomped on it. And now you want a second chance?" Her sobs grew louder, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. I'd spent years drowning in my own pain, questioning what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough. The weight of what remains. Samantha's sobs filled the room, a painful symphony of regret and desperation. I stood there, arms crossed, feeling like a spectator to her unraveling. And yet, beneath my anger, something stirred. A pang of sadness, an ache for the life we'd built together, and the life I thought we'd have. For years, I'd carried the weight of her betrayal like a stone lodged deep in my chest. It had hardened me, shaped me, but also drained me of something vital. Standing before her now, the source of my pain laid bare and broken, I felt something I hadn't expected: exhaustion. I sank into the chair across from her, letting out a slow, measured breath. "You know," I began, my voice quieter now, "for a long time I blamed myself. I thought I wasn't good enough, that I didn't give you what you needed. I replayed every argument, every moment I might have missed a sign, trying to figure out what I could have done differently." Her tear-streaked face lifted, her eyes wide with remorse. "Alex, it was never about you." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't try to absolve me of the guilt I carried for so long. I know now it wasn't my fault, but back then it ate me alive. I questioned everything: my worth, my ability to trust, even my capacity to love." She bowed her head, her hands gripping the edge of the coffee table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I know I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand," she whispered, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Why, Samantha, why did you do it? 10 years, that's not a mistake. That's a choice you made over and over again." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the table. "At first, it was selfishness. I wanted excitement, validation, something to fill the void I didn't even know I had. But as time went on, it became this spiral. I told myself I could stop whenever I wanted, but I didn't. And then the lies piled up, and I was too scared to face what I'd done." Her words were like daggers, cutting through the anger that had shielded me for so long. I'd always imagined her infidelity as something cold and calculated, but hearing her admit to her fear and self-destruction added a layer of complexity I wasn't prepared for. It didn't excuse her actions, but it made them human. "You had 10 years to come clean," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Why didn't you? Why wait until it all fell apart?" "I was a coward," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to lose you, even though I knew I already had in so many ways. I thought if I just pretended long enough I could fix it without you ever knowing." I leaned back, letting her words sink in. For so long I'd imagined this moment, what I'd say, how I'd make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But now that it was here, the anger that had once burned so brightly felt dim, replaced by something heavier, more complicated. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, the words coming out slower than I intended. I don't know if I even want to. She nodded, her tears falling silently now. I understand, she said. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Alex. I needed you to know how sorry I am for everything. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling between us. For the first time, I saw her not as the villain of my story, but as a deeply flawed person who had let her own insecurities destroy the one thing that mattered most. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it easier to breathe. I don't hate you, I said after a long pause. I thought I did for a long time, but I don't. Hating you would mean you still have power over me, and I've worked too hard to rebuild myself to let that happen. Her lip quivered, and she wiped, her face with the sleeve of her sweater. You've always been stronger than me, she said, her voice trembling. I hope one day you can find someone who gives you what I couldn't. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because of their honesty, but because they forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. I didn't know if I was ready to let someone else in, to trust again. But for the first time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could be. As Samantha stood to leave, she hesitated, glancing back at me with a look that was equal parts hope and resignation. Thank you, she said softly, for letting me say my piece. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the door closed, behind her, the silence that followed felt different, less oppressive, more peaceful. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folder still open on the table. The evidence of her betrayal was still there, unchanged, but for the first time, it felt like a relic of the past rather than a wound that refused to heal. I didn't know what the future held, but as I sat there in the quiet of my home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The path of redemption. Samantha walked out of Alex's home feeling lighter than she had in years, but the weight of her choices still clung to her like a shadow. His forgiveness, or rather his lack of hatred, was more than she had expected, but less than she had hoped for. Yet, it was enough. It was a beginning. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the crisp air stung her cheeks, and she wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The city bustled around her, indifferent to the storm that raged within. She had spent the last 5 years trying to make sense of her mistakes, but until now, she hadn't truly faced them. Looking Alex in the eyes and seeing the pain she had caused made it all real in a way she hadn't allowed herself to confront. She needed to rebuild herself, not for Alex, not even for redemption, but because she couldn't live the rest of her life as the woman who destroyed everything good in her path. Step 1. Facing the truth. Samantha's first step was to confront the people who had been complicit in her affairs. The other men, the so-called friends who had encouraged her deceit, and even her own family, who had unknowingly enabled her double life. She couldn't move forward without making peace with the past, and that meant addressing it head-on. One by one, she reached out. Some conversations were met with anger, others with indifference. A few people offered their own apologies, admitting they should have stopped her rather than turning a blind eye. But the hardest was the conversation with her parents. Samantha's mother, a woman of quiet strength, sat across from her at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together. Her father leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "I've done terrible things," Samantha began, her voice trembling. "Things I'm not proud of, and I can't expect you to understand, but I need you to know that I'm trying to be better." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "We've always loved you, Samantha, but love doesn't mean we condone what you've done. If you want our support, you need to show us you're serious about changing." Her father nodded, his jaw tight. "Actions speak louder than words, kiddo. You've got a long road ahead, but if you're willing to walk it, we'll be here." Their words, though tough, gave her a glimmer of hope. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone in her journey. Step 2. Therapy and self-reflection. Samantha had avoided therapy for years, telling herself she didn't need it. But deep down, she knew the root of her behavior lay in wounds she hadn't allowed herself to heal. She found a therapist, a woman named Dr. Keller, who radiated warmth but didn't shy away from hard truths. In their sessions, Samantha began to unpack the insecurities that had driven her actions, her fear of failure, her need for validation, and the self-loathing she had buried beneath a polished exterior. She talked about Alex, about the life they'd built and the ways she had sabotaged it. Dr. Keller didn't judge. Instead, she asked questions that forced Samantha to look deeper, to peel back the layers of her own denial. "Why do you think you stayed in the marriage while betraying it at the same time?" Dr. Keller asked one day. Samantha hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Because I was afraid of being alone. Alex was steady, dependable. He was everything I wasn't. And I couldn't stand the thought of losing that, even though I didn't deserve it. Dr. Keller nodded thoughtfully. "So you clung to him while seeking validation elsewhere. Do you think you've ever truly validated yourself?" The question lingered in Samantha's mind long after the session ended. Step 3. Giving back. As part of her healing, Samantha sought ways to turn her pain into something meaningful. She began volunteering at a local shelter for women escaping toxic relationships. At first, she felt like a fraud. What right did she have to help others when she had caused so much harm? But as she listened to the women's stories, she realized that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. One woman, a young mother named Elena, reminded Samantha of herself. Elena spoke of feeling trapped in a cycle of self-destructive behavior, of pushing away those who cared for her. Samantha didn't offer advice. Instead, she shared her own story. She didn't sugarcoat her mistakes, and for the first time, she saw her past as something that could help others, rather than just a source of shame. Step 4. Facing Alex again. A year later, Samantha stood outside Alex's home once more, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't here to ask for forgiveness or a second chance. She knew better than that. She was here to thank him. When Alex opened the door, his expression was cautious but not unkind. "Samantha," he said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" The weight of closure. Samantha's apology echoed in my mind long after she walked out the door. I stood in the same spot for minutes, hours perhaps, lost in thought. Her words had struck a chord I didn't know was still capable of resonating. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I used to be. The fire that had burned through me for years had reduced itself to embers. But what was left in its place? I poured myself a glass of water and sat down, staring at the faint reflection in the window. My life had changed so much since the divorce, so much since her. I thought I'd moved on, but her visit had unearthed something I hadn't expected. Doubt. Was it possible to forgive without fully understanding? Could I move forward without untangling the mess of emotions she had left behind? Looking back, the years after Samantha and I divorced had been a blur of rebuilding. I focused on my career, leaned into my role as a father, and tried to piece together the fragments of a life I hadn't chosen, but had been forced to accept, and I succeeded. Or so I thought. But as I replayed her apology, fragments of the past slipped through the cracks of my carefully constructed present. Memories of late nights at the office, of the way her smile used to light up a room, of the tension that had crept into our marriage like a silent predator. I remembered the small moments I'd ignored, the tiny signs of her distance that I had chalked up to stress or fatigue. I had been so focused on providing, on being the pillar of our family, that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming beneath my feet. And then there was the betrayal. Her affair. The discovery had been like a knife to the gut. But what lingered longer than the pain was the humiliation. The questions I couldn't stop asking myself: was I not enough? Was there something I could have done differently? The evidence that changed everything. As I sat there, my mind wandered to a memory I had buried deep. It was a year after our divorce, during one of my routine efforts to declutter. I had found an old shoebox in the back of the closet, tucked behind a row of my winter coats. Inside were notes, receipts, and pictures that I hadn't seen before. Evidence of an affair that hadn't lasted months, as she had claimed, but years. 10 years. The timeline hit me like a freight train. It spanned nearly half of our marriage, overlapping with birthdays, anniversaries, and even the birth of our daughter. I remember sitting on the bedroom floor, staring at the contents of that box, feeling the ground shift beneath me. At that moment, I had two choices: confront her or let it go. I chose the latter, not out of cowardice, but out of self-preservation. I told myself I didn't need to know more. The marriage was over, and dredging up more pain wouldn't change that. But now, sitting in my living room years later, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. Confronting the past the next morning, I called my therapist. A decision I hadn't made lightly. Dr. Morris had been a lifeline during the initial years after the divorce, helping me navigate the chaos of single parenthood and self-doubt. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but now I needed her insight more than ever. "I saw her again," I admitted during our session. "Samantha, she apologized." Dr. Morris leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but attentive. "And how did that make you feel?" I hesitated. Conflicted. Part of me believed she was sincere, but another part of me, I don't know if I can trust it. She nodded. "Trust is hard to rebuild, especially when the betrayal runs as deep as yours. But forgiveness isn't about trust. It's about freeing yourself from the hold the past has on you." Her words stayed with me as I left the session. Forgiveness. It was a word I had always associated with weakness, with letting someone off the hook. But now, I realized it wasn't about Samantha. It was about me. Seeking answers. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the shoebox. The contents were as I remembered: restaurant receipts, text messages printed out, and photos of moments that should never have existed. This time, though, I didn't look at them with anger. Instead, I looked at them with curiosity, with the intent to understand. I saw a pattern in her behavior, a desperation for something I hadn't provided. It wasn't an excuse. Nothing could excuse what she had done, but it was an explanation. Samantha had been searching for validation, for excitement, for something I had been too preoccupied to notice she needed, and in those moments of clarity, I realized that I wasn't blameless. I hadn't cheated, but I hadn't been present either. I had been so focused on being a provider that I had forgotten to be a partner. The letter A week later, I sat down at my desk with a pen and paper. I wasn't writing to Samantha for her sake. I was writing for mine. In the letter I never sent. After Samantha's apology, my world remained still, but something inside me shifted. Her words, laced with genuine regret, had opened a door I had kept shut for too long. But stepping through that door meant facing everything I had avoided, everything I had buried. It was a week later, on a quiet evening, that I decided to revisit the past. The shoebox was still there, tucked away in the back of my closet like a ghost waiting to be acknowledged. I pulled it out and set it on the dining table, the weight of it far heavier than the cardboard and paper it contained. For the first time in years, I opened it, not with the anger or pain that had once consumed me, but with the intention of understanding. Pieces of the past. The contents were exactly as I remembered. Receipts from dinners I hadn't attended, text messages printed out like evidence in a trial, and photos that confirmed what my gut had always known. I sifted through them slowly, not rushing the process. Each piece of evidence felt like a puzzle piece to a picture I had refused to complete. 1. Receipt stood out, a dinner date on our anniversary. She had told me she was working late that night. I remembered how I had sat at home nursing a glass of wine, convincing myself that her absence was justified. She's stressed. She's tired. This isn't about me. But it had been about me. Or, rather, it had been about us. About the distance that had grown between us while I wasn't looking. As I went through the box, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at myself. The letter. That night I sat down with a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Samantha, your visit last week stirred something in me I wasn't prepared for. Hearing your apology brought back memories I thought I had. Buried, some good, some bad, and some that still hurt more than I want to admit. I paused, staring at the words. It felt strange to write to her after all this time, but I kept going. When I found out about the affair, I thought the pain would destroy me. But the truth is, the affair wasn't what broke us. It was everything that led up to it. The missed moments, the unspoken words, the walls we both built between us. I wasn't blameless, and I see that now. My hand trembled as I wrote, That doesn't excuse what you did. Nothing can. But I've carried this anger for so long, and it's weighed me down in ways I didn't realize. I think it's time to let it go. I folded the letter and placed it in the shoebox alongside the evidence of her betrayal, but instead of hiding it away, I took the box outside to the fire pit. The the flames consumed the box. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Watching the past burn wasn't about forgetting, it was about releasing. The memories would always be a part of me, but they no longer had power over me. Finding closure. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less about Samantha and more about myself, about the man I had become and the life I wanted to build. Her apology had given me something I didn't realize I needed: permission to move on. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. I was free to define myself by what came next. Revenge or something more. The fire that consumed the shoebox didn't burn out the memories, but it marked the end of an era. For years, I had lived as a man shaped by betrayal, haunted, angry, and unsure of how to trust again. Now, with Samantha's apology still echoing in my ears and the ashes of the past scattered, I found myself at a crossroads. Forgiveness was one path, but another darker, more alluring road lay ahead. Revenge. Not the reckless, impulsive kind of revenge born of rage, but something more methodical. If Samantha had spent a decade weaving a web of lies behind my back, was it not only fitting to let her feel the weight of those same lies unravel around her? I sat with the idea longer than I cared to admit, the flicker of vengeance kindling something I hadn't felt in years: control. The planet started innocently enough. I went online, scrolling through her public profiles. Samantha had spent the past few years cultivating the image of a woman who had found herself. Her posts were filled with smiling photos of charity events, motivational quotes, and glowing updates about her career. To anyone else, she looked like a woman who had turned her life around. But I knew better. I started digging, carefully, quietly. Old acquaintances, former colleagues, even a few friends we'd shared during our marriage. It didn't take long to piece together the real story. Samantha's carefully curated life was a facade. Her success was propped up by strategic alliances, half-truths, and favors owed. I wasn't surprised, but I was intrigued. This wasn't about exposing her or ruining her life. That would be too simple. No, this was about balance, about letting her feel what it was like to stand on unstable ground. The first move. The first crack in her foundation came in the form of an anonymous tip. I contacted a colleague of hers, someone I knew had been burned by Samantha's ambition in the past. I sent them a message outlining some discrepancies in her work history. Nothing too blatant, just enough to raise questions. It didn't take long for the ripple effect to begin. Samantha's reputation, so carefully constructed, began to fray at the edges. I watched from a distance as the cracks spread, the same way I had watched my own life unravel years ago. There was a sense of satisfaction in it, but also something hollow, an unexpected revelation. One evening, while going through the remnants of my investigation, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. An old email thread. It was from years ago, during the height of her affair. The messages weren't between Samantha and her lover. They were between Samantha and someone I didn't recognize, a therapist. In the emails, she spoke about her guilt, her unhappiness, and her desperate attempts to find meaning in a life that felt suffocating. "I know what I'm doing is wrong," one message read, "but it's the only time I feel alive. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to fix this." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I had painted Samantha as the villain of our story. But these emails revealed a woman who was just as lost as I had been. Revenge or redemption? The discovery forced me to reevaluate everything, my plan, my anger, even my definition of justice. Samantha's actions had hurt me in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but they had come from a place of deep pain and confusion. Did that excuse what she had done? No, but it did complicate the narrative I had clung to for so long. I sat with the emails for hours, rereading them until the words blurred together. The more I read, the more I realized that revenge wouldn't bring me closure. It would only perpetuate the cycle of pain we had both been trapped in. The final decision. In the end, I decided to let go, not just of my plan for revenge, but of the anger that had fueled it. I deleted the emails, erased my notes, and stepped away from the web of lies I had been so intent on unraveling. Samantha would face her own consequences, whether through the cracks in her facade or the weight of her own guilt. It wasn't my place to play judge, jury, and executioner. What mattered now was me, my life, my happiness, and my ability to move forward without the shadow of the past looming over me. A new chapter. Months later, I found myself in a new relationship. She was kind, thoughtful, and completely different from Samantha in every way. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again, like I could build something real without the ghosts of betrayal haunting me. Samantha's apology had opened a door, but it was my choice to walk through it. And in doing so, I discovered that the best revenge wasn't tearing her down, it was building myself back up, because in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in making her pay, it was in reclaiming my own happiness. The second path, a calculated reckoning. I stared at Samantha's apology letter for the 100th time. A thought that I couldn't ignore began to crystallize. Closure, forgiveness. Those words sounded noble, but they tasted hollow. Samantha had walked into my life again, unbidden, and unleashed a storm of emotions I had spent years burying. She wanted absolution, a clean slate for herself. But what about the wreckage she left behind? What about me? If she thought she could return after years of deceit and escape unscathed, she had underestimated the man she betrayed. I folded her letter carefully and placed it in the same box I had nearly burned weeks ago, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of what needed to be done. The first domino. The first step was simple: study her. Over the years, Samantha had built a pristine reputation, portraying herself as the woman who had overcome adversity and emerged stronger. Her social media was a polished highlight reel, professional accomplishments, philanthropic ventures, and carefully framed moments of joy. But I had lived with her. I knew the truth beneath the image. Samantha wasn't strong. She was a master of illusion. And every illusion has its cracks. I began reaching out to people who had crossed paths with her, former colleagues, acquaintances, even the ones she had burned on her way to the top. At first they were hesitant, but it didn't take much to loosen their tongues. Samantha's charm had its limits, and I found a surprising number of people eager to see her brought down. The hidden truth, through my digging, I uncovered something unexpected. Samantha's career wasn't as pristine as it appeared. A poorly managed project here, a fabricated accomplishment there. It was all swept under the rug by her ability to spin narratives. The evidence wasn't hard to find once I knew where to look. Old contracts, internal memos, even an incriminating email or two. Samantha's professional empire was built on shaky foundations, and I held the matches. But revenge isn't about destruction for destruction's sake. It's about precision. The strategic strike? I didn't go public with what I found. That would have been too obvious, too quick. Instead, I fed the information to the right people, a journalist hungry for a scandal, a rival who had been waiting for a chance to strike, and a whistleblower looking for redemption. I watched from the sidelines as the first cracks began to show. Articles questioning her credibility appeared online, anonymous tips trickled into her workplace, and whispers spread through her social circles. Samantha's world, so carefully constructed, began to wobble. The confrontation, it wasn't long before. Samantha reached out to me. Her voice, once so confident, now carried an edge of desperation. "Alex," she began, trying to mask the tremor in her tone. "Have you heard what's been happening? People are spreading lies about me." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. "Lies?" Her frustration bubbled over. "Yes, lies. Someone's digging into my past, twisting things. I don't know who's behind it, but it's affecting my career, my reputation." I let out a soft chuckle. Reputation is a funny thing, isn't it? So fragile, so easily shattered, almost like trust. The line went silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Alex, was it you?" I didn't answer directly. "You came back into my life, Samantha. You opened old wounds. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" The fallout in. The weeks that followed, Samantha's carefully curated image continued to crumble. She lost a major client. Her employer launched an internal review, and whispers of scandal spread like wildfire. But I didn't stick around to watch her fall apart completely. I had no interest in witnessing her unraveling firsthand. My revenge wasn't about savoring her pain. It was about reclaiming my power. Samantha had controlled the narrative for so long, but now the pen was in my hand. A new beginning, one evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Revenge hadn't consumed me as I feared it might. Instead, it had freed me. By holding Samantha accountable, I had closed a chapter of my life that had been left open for far too long. The man I had become wasn't shaped by her betrayal, but by how I chose to rise from it. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. The second path. Samantha's perspective. The weight of redemption. As I watched Alex walk away from the cafe, his back straight and purposeful, a knot of emotions churned in my chest. Relief, regret, and a deep sadness I couldn't shake. Had spent the past 5 years convincing myself that I had done the right thing by leaving him alone, that he was better off without me. But the truth was, I had been a coward, afraid to confront the damage I had caused. And now, after baring my soul to him, I was left with the one thing I feared most, the unknown. Would he ever forgive me? The beginning of the end. When Alex and I were married, I had believed we were building something unshakable. He was everything I thought I needed: kind, steady, and endlessly supportive. But as the years went on, I began to feel an emptiness I couldn't name. It wasn't Alex's fault. He gave me everything, but deep down, I knew I wasn't giving him the same in return. The affair wasn't premeditated. It started as a distraction, a fleeting escape from the weight of my insecurities. I told myself it was harmless, a mistake I would correct before. It went too far, but it did go too far. And by the time I realized what I had done, it was too late to undo the damage. The spiral. After the divorce, I told myself I was moving on. I threw myself into my career, built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But no matter how many accolades I earned or how many parties I attended, the guilt never left me. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I would think about Alex, about the life we had shared, the love I had thrown away. I wanted to reach out, to explain, but I was paralyzed by fear. What could I say that wouldn't sound hollow? How could I ask for forgiveness when I couldn't forgive myself? The decision to return. The decision to contact Alex had come after years of hesitation. It wasn't triggered by a single moment, but by a growing realization that I couldn't keep living with the weight of my mistakes. When I wrote him that letter, my hands shook the entire time. I didn't expect a response, and when he agreed to meet me, I was equal parts relieved and terrified. Seeing him again was harder than I had imagined. He looked older, more tired, but there was a strength in him that hadn't been there before. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare every thought and feeling I had carried since our marriage ended, but words felt inadequate. How do you apologize for breaking someone's heart? The aftermath. The meeting at the cafe didn't go as I had hoped, but it went as I expected. Alex's anger, his pain, they were deserved, and I accepted them without protest. But when he said he couldn't forgive me, something inside me shattered. I had spent so long clinging to the hope that his forgiveness would absolve me, that it would ease the burden I carried. Instead, I walked away with the realization that forgiveness might never come, and that was something I had to learn to live with. The road ahead. In the weeks following our meeting, I began to confront the truth about myself. My betrayal hadn't just hurt Alex. It had revealed the cracks in my own character, the parts of me I had refused to face. I started therapy, not to absolve myself, but to understand why I had made the choices I did. For the first time, I began to unpack the insecurities and fears that had driven me to destroy the one relationship that had truly mattered. A glimmer of hope one evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun set, I thought about Alex. Not with guilt or regret, but with gratitude. Our meeting hadn't given me the closure I had hoped for, but it had given me something more valuable, the push I needed to change. I didn't know if Alex would ever forgive me, but for the first time I realized that his forgiveness wasn't the key to my redemption. That was a journey I had to take on my own, the road to redemption. Samantha's journey in the weeks after meeting Alex, I felt like I was living in the shadow of my past. The cafe, his steady gaze, and his words, filled with pain but not malice, lingered in my mind. He hadn't forgiven me, and I didn't blame him. But his final words, "I can't keep carrying this anymore," had unlocked something in me. For years, I had carried my guilt like a boulder strapped to my back, hoping for someone else to lift it. That day, I realized forgiveness wasn't something Alex could give me. It was something I had to give myself. Facing the mirror, the first thing I did was book an appointment with a therapist. I had resisted therapy for years, convincing myself that I could handle my pain alone. But as I sat in that quiet room, facing a stranger who asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, I realized how much I had buried. "Why do you think you cheated?" the therapist asked during our second session. I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I don't know. I felt empty." "Empty how?" "Like I wasn't enough," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not for Alex, not for myself. I thought if I stepped outside of our marriage, I'd find something to fill that void. But it only made it worse. For the first time, I began to see my betrayal not as a single act of selfishness, but as a symptom of deeper insecurities I had carried for years. Confronting the past. My sessions forced me to confront memories I had tried to forget. The arguments with Alex that I avoided by pretending everything was fine. The times I lied to cover my tracks. The moment he discovered the truth and looked at me as though he didn't know me anymore. One evening, I pulled out an old box of photos from our time together. There we were, smiling on our honeymoon, laughing, at a picnic, celebrating anniversaries. Each picture was a reminder of what we had once shared and what I had destroyed. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry, Alex. I'm so sorry." A letter never sent. As part of my therapy, I wrote Alex a letter, not to send, but to express everything I couldn't say during our meeting. "Dear Alex, there are so many things I wish I could tell you, but I don't know if they would make a difference. I don't know if they would even matter. I want you to know that I see you. I see the man I hurt, the love I took for granted. You were my anchor, and I let go of you because I didn't know how to hold on to myself. That's not an excuse. It's the truth. You deserved better than what I gave you. I hope you found happiness, even if it's without me. And I hope one day you can think of me without pain. I'll carry this regret with me forever. But I'll also carry the lessons you taught me. Thank you for being who you are, and thank you for meeting me, even when I didn't deserve it." With all the remorse in my heart, Samantha rebuilding writing that letter felt like shedding a layer of skin. It didn't absolve me, but it helped me start to see a path forward. I began volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young women who were struggling with their own relationships and self-worth. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I also reconnected with old friends I had pushed away during my darkest times. Slowly, I started to rebuild my life, not as an escape, but as an act of accountability. A chance encounter. Months later, I ran into Alex at a bookstore. He looked surprised to see me, but there was no anger in his eyes, only curiosity. "Samantha," he said, his tone neutral but not cold. "How are you?" "I'm better," I said honestly. "How about you?" He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I'm doing well." We chatted briefly, the conversation light but meaningful. For the first time, there was no tension between us, no weight of unspoken words. As we parted ways, I felt a sense of peace. Alex and I would never return to what we once were, but perhaps in time, we could both find healing in our own ways. The journey. Continues forgiveness didn't come overnight, nor did redemption. But day by day, I learned to live with my mistakes, to grow from them rather than let them define me. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. And as I looked toward the future, I knew I had the strength to build a life rooted in honesty and self-acceptance. Because for the first time in years, I believed I was enough. Alex's journey. Forward, navigating the aftermath. The day I ran into Samantha at the bookstore felt surreal. I hadn't expected to see her again, not like this. There was something undeniably different about her, but it wasn't the kind of difference I could put into words. Her eyes weren't filled with the same pain I remembered, and her smile, though tentative, held a quiet strength. But I didn't know if I was ready to confront those feelings again. Feelings that had been dormant, buried under layers of anger and regret. As she walked away, something in me stirred. A flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Maybe? Or was it just curiosity? Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it. The weight of the past. For a long time after the divorce, I had convinced myself that closing the door on Samantha was the best choice. The betrayal, the heartache, the dishonesty, all of it had scarred me in ways I still didn't fully understand. I'd tried to fill the void with work, with distractions, with fleeting relationships, but nothing seemed to make a dent in the emptiness that lingered just beneath the surface. The truth was, I hadn't fully let go of her. Not the woman who cheated, not the woman who hurt me, but the woman I had once loved, the one who shared quiet mornings, whispered dreams, and a life I thought would last forever. When she apologized, I had wanted to lash out. I wanted to tell her that forgiveness wasn't something I could give, that some wounds never heal, but something in her presence stopped me. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just the raw, unvarnished truth of her regret. I didn't know what to do with that, and for the first time, I didn't want to act on impulse. I just wanted to think. The quiet shift weeks passed after our encounter at the bookstore, and I found myself thinking about Samantha more than I expected. I wasn't sure if it was the weight of the past catching up with me, or simply the realization that life wasn't as black and white as I had once believed. I started to re-examine my own actions during the marriage. I had been angry, yes, but I had been hurt too. And in my anger, I had allowed my pain to define my decisions. Perhaps she wasn't the only one who needed to heal. The unexpected call. It was a rainy Wednesday when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before picking it up, uncertain of what to expect. "Alex?" I recognized the voice instantly. It was Samantha. I took a breath, the air thick with anticipation. "Samantha," I replied, my tone guarded. "What's this about?" "I know it's been a while, but I wanted to say something," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of vulnerability. "I don't expect anything from you. I don't even know why I'm calling, honestly. But I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. I'm in therapy. I've been working through a lot of things, and I'm finally understanding why I did what I did." I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to shut her out, to ignore everything she was saying. But the other part, one I didn't recognize, found myself listening closely. "I just wanted you to know I've changed, Alex, and I can never undo what I did, but I want you to know that I've learned from it, and if you ever need anything from me, I'm here." Her words hung in the air, suspended between us. I couldn't tell if this was an attempt to patch things up or simply her need for closure. But I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Samantha," I said, my voice low. "But I do think you deserve to move on. And so do I." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, there was a quiet relief in her voice. "I don't need your forgiveness anymore, Alex," she said softly. "I just needed you to hear me, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of release. The uncharted path. That phone call didn't change everything overnight. There was no magical moment where the past suddenly dissolved into nothingness, but it was a step, an important one, for both of us. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I wasn't going to carry my anger forever. It wasn't about forgiving Samantha. It was about letting go of the chains that had kept me tied to the past. I threw myself into my work, focusing on projects that had long been sidelined. Slowly, I began to rebuild a life that wasn't defined by the failure of my marriage, and while I never stopped thinking about Samantha, I learned to make peace with the part of her that I couldn't change. The quiet endings and beginnings. Months later, I found myself walking through a park on an autumn afternoon. The leaves were golden crisp beneath my feet, and the air was sharp with the scent of change. I spotted her across the park bench, her hair slightly wind-blown, a gentle smile on her face. The road to closure. Alex's inner reckoning. After I left the bookstore that day, I couldn't shake the image of Samantha from my mind. There was something about her, something subdued, perhaps even humbled, that didn't match the person I had buried in my memory. She had always carried herself with a kind of confidence, even arrogance, that now seemed absent. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. For days, I avoided confronting the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. I threw myself into work, into exercise, into anything that would keep me from revisiting that chapter of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, her words replayed in my mind. I see the pain I caused, Alex, and I'm sorry. Was it enough? Could an apology, no matter how heartfelt, ever bridge the chasm left by betrayal? The shadows of betrayal. It wasn't just the affair that haunted me. It was the way it had unraveled everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and myself. I had given Samantha the best parts of me, or at least I believed I had. But had I really? Sitting alone in my apartment one night, I found myself staring at an old photo of us. We were laughing, arms around each other, the sunset behind us painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. It had been taken on a trip to Italy, a dream vacation we'd planned for years. I remembered how happy I'd been that day, but now, looking at it, I couldn't help but wonder, was that happiness real for her too? Or had the cracks already started to form? Seeking answers, within unable to shake the questions gnawing at me, I decided to confront them head-on. I began journaling, a practice I hadn't touched since college. I wrote about the pain, the anger, the betrayal. But I also wrote about the love, the laughter, and the moments that had once felt perfect. Through those pages, I started to see patterns, not just in Samantha's actions, but in my own. I had always prided myself on being a good husband, but had I truly been present? Had I noticed her unhappiness before it spilled over into something irreparable? The answers weren't clear-cut, but they were necessary. I began to understand that our marriage hadn't failed in a vacuum. It was the result of 1,000 tiny fissures that neither of us had addressed. A second encounter. Weeks later, I found myself back at the bookstore. I wasn't looking for Samantha. I wasn't even sure I wanted to see her. But fate had other plans. She was standing in the aisle, flipping through a paperback, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, I considered walking away, but something stopped me. "Hi, Samantha," I said, my voice steady but quiet. She turned, startled, before offering me a tentative smile. "Alex, hi." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment before she spoke again. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Neither was I admitted. There was a weight between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed to know how to break. Finally, I gestured to the book in her hands. "Good read?" She glanced down at it, then back at me. "I wouldn't know. I'm still deciding if I'm ready for it." Her words felt heavier than they should have, and I wondered if she was talking about more than just the book. The conversation that followed. We ended up sitting in the cafe attached to the bookstore, nursing cups of coffee that quickly grew, cold as we talked. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were long pauses, moments where words seemed too fragile to carry the weight of what needed to be said. But Samantha didn't shy away from the hard truths. "I don't expect forgiveness. Alex," she said at one point, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. "I don't even know if I deserve it. But I needed you to know that I'm not the same person I was back then." I studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all I saw was a woman trying to make sense of her own mistakes, just as I had been trying to make sense of mine. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice low. "But I don't want to carry this anger anymore. It's exhausting." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I understand." For the first time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: closure. Moving forward. That meeting didn't erase the past, nor did it magically heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other. But it felt like a turning point, a chance to let go of the resentment that had held me captive for so long. In the weeks that followed, I found myself feeling lighter. I began to focus on the present, rather than dwelling on what could have been. I reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at a local community center, and even signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. And while Samantha remained a part of my past, she no longer haunted me. Samantha's perspective, the weight of redemption. I didn't expect to see Alex again after our meeting in the bookstore. That single moment had been more than I'd hoped for, a chance to say the words I'd practiced in the mirror countless times. But when he left, I knew I couldn't count on his forgiveness, and I didn't blame him. The weight of my choices had followed me every day for the past 5 years. At first, it was easy to ignore. I threw myself into distractions, new relationships, a demanding job, anything that would drown out the quiet voice reminding me of what I'd done. But that voice grew louder with time. A life unraveled after the divorce. My life felt hollow, though I refused to admit it. I painted over the cracks with a smile and convinced myself that I was fine. Happy even. But happiness doesn't come from running. It comes from facing what you've left behind. For years, I avoided places that reminded me of Alex. The coffee shop where we used to sit and dream about the future. The park where we'd spent lazy Sunday afternoons. Even the Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated our anniversaries. It wasn't until I saw him again, standing in that bookstore, that I realized how much I'd been avoiding myself. The bookstore encounter, when Alex greeted me that day, my heart felt like it had stopped mid-beat. I wasn't prepared to face him, not like that. Yet there he was, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was different now, older, perhaps a little more guarded. But there was something else, too. A quiet strength that hadn't been there before. We spoke briefly, but even in those few moments, I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us. When he asked about the book in my hands, I almost laughed. How could we talk about something so trivial when everything else was screaming to be said? But I followed his lead, grateful for the chance to talk, no matter how small. The cafe conversation, sitting across from Alex in the bookstore cafe, felt surreal. For years, I'd imagined what I would say if I ever saw him again. But the rehearsed lines disappeared the moment he looked at me. "I don't expect forgiveness," I told him, my voice trembling. It was the truth. I didn't deserve it, but I needed him to know that I had changed. In the years since our divorce, I had gone to therapy, trying to understand why I'd made the choices I had. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of Alex. It was a betrayal of myself. I had let my insecurities, my fears, and my selfishness dictate my actions. And in the process, I had destroyed something beautiful, the aftermath of honesty. When Alex admitted that he didn't know if he could forgive me, my heart broke all over again. But I didn't blame him. Forgiveness wasn't something I could demand. It was a gift he had to choose to give. Still, hearing him say that he didn't want to carry the anger anymore gave me a glimmer of hope. Not for reconciliation, but for peace. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. I knew this might be the last time we spoke, but at least I had finally said what I needed to say. A new beginning. In the weeks following our conversation, I found myself reflecting on the life I had built since the divorce. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, sharing my story with those who had faced betrayal in their own lives. It was a way to give back, to turn my mistakes into something meaningful. I also reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. They reminded me of the person I used to be, the person I wanted to be again. The road to redemption. Don't know if Alex and I will ever cross paths again, but I do know this. Meeting him that day in the bookstore reminded me of the importance of accountability and growth. I can't undo the past, but I can learn from it. I can strive to be better, not for Alex or anyone else, but for myself. And as I take each step forward, I carry with me the lessons of love, loss, and the resilience that comes from facing the truth.